So wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. So we are finally here. You may have noticed we had some technical difficulties. We're now hooked up to my laptop. And that actually means that we have to do the session without the demo. So you won't see anything live presented, unfortunately. But we do have everything on his machine to actually demonstrate it. So if you want to, we are happy to run it later on in the tech exchange or set up a webinar later on to prove that whatever Bob says actually is true. But I'm also here to guarantee that he's not saying something out of the border. So welcome to the session, API Management with InterSystems IRIS. You see that this is a joint session between Bob and myself. One plea before we actually start with the content. Who's excited about having an in-person event again? Yeah, huh? Isn't that nice? So one of the nice things about in-person events is that networking is really simple, right? Just turn to your left, turn to your right, and if you don't know that person, right, make a note and introduce yourself to that person after this session, right? We're going to do the same thing right now, right? So in case you don't know me, my name is Stefan Wittmann. I've been with the company since 2007 in many different roles. Right now, I'm a PM, a product manager, taking care of interoperability in general. So that's everything you've seen basically in the session before with Health Connect Cloud. I'm taking care of language interoperability. So that's everything with Java, with .NET, with Python, JavaScript. And I'm still taking care of API management. Bob is going to take care of that in the future from now. That's why Bob is going to introduce himself too.
Hi, I'm Bob Kuszewski.
If you're not muted.
If I'm not muted, am I muted?
Is that funny? You can be muted in physical events too, it's not just in virtual.
All right. Did I mute myself?
You're unmuted.
So I'm Bob Kuszewski. I started here in January of 2020, so right before the pandemic. So this is my first in-person global summit. So it is great to see people face-to-face for the first time, and I'm excited about that. I want to thank Stefan for inviting me to join him up here today, and I'll be taking on, as he said, the product management responsibility for the API Manager moving forward.
Wonderful. See, that's how easy it is, right? So this session, we're going to cover a couple of things. First and foremost, we're going to do a quick overview of IAM, the short name of the InterSystems API Manager. So in case you haven't played around with it, you don't really know what it is, I will give you a quick tour about it. Not too much, right? Because we actually want to spend most of the time about what's new next. So in case you haven't heard yet, there's really fresh news like today, right? That we released the next version of IAM 2.8. So we're going to cover all of the new things and new features that are in that version. So you get an overview of all the new and shiny things that you can take advantage of. So those are obviously all the benefits of this session here, right? You get an overview of what API management is, why you should take care of it, why you should leverage it, and what the newest additions are in that space. You might wonder, why should I even use API management, right? In case you don't have API management installed today in your environment, you might just be fine, right? I mean, you can always just take a REST client or an application and send a request to your REST endpoints and you're fine with it, right? Why would you need an additional layer to manage your traffic, right? Early on when you start, I don't know, you have a couple of endpoints, that all seems simple and trivial, right? You have everything under control, you know exactly what these endpoints are supposed to do, and if they don't work, well, you figure that out, right? You understand right from the start when something doesn't work, so what help does this API management layer actually provide, right? So first of all, these systems grow complex really, really damn fast, right? You're always adding new endpoints on the fly. So without even knowing, your environment is going to grow much, much more than you can handle effectively without such a layer. And the second thing is the layer gives you monitoring right off the bat, right? As soon as you install it and set it up, which takes about, what, 5 minutes, right? You get immediate response from the layer telling you these are the amount of requests and responses that get through your environment. And if something is funky and doesn't work like it's expected, it will tell you like right away. Even in scenarios where you think everything works fine. So like if you've been at Global Summit 2019, we had an experience lab which included API management and also the Fire repository. So one of the things we realized when we installed the API Manager is that we authenticated with OAuth 2, right? One of the very basic things that you do with REST. And it just authenticated fine, at least we thought so, because we got logged in when we pushed the button. But then you go into the API management layer and it told us, hey, you know what? You're doing 3 requests and the first 2 failed and the third one succeeded because of how complex the OAuth 2 authentication process can be. The first 2 failed because the server was configured wrong and the third one finally succeeded, right? So you wouldn't even notice that because the functionality seems to be just fine, right? You will notice that something is wrong as soon as you start to scale up, right? Because then everything hell breaks loose and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm doing way too many requests. I shouldn't do 3 times as many requests as I'm doing, right? So that's something you get like right off the bat at the very beginning, and that's very helpful. And that's the reason why I'm using the API Manager even on my development machine when I'm local and I'm not doing anything in production, because it's helping me debug everything that I do right away. It's a cost saver, right? And API management by itself is actually pretty complicated. It's a huge field, as you can see here. It's a magic quadrant of its own by Gartner. And that's one of the reasons why we decided back in 2019 to not do this ourselves, but to partner, right? So every time we say the InterSystems API Manager, actually we're using another technology underneath, which is provided by our partner called Kong, based in San Francisco. Kong on this chart here at the very far right is one of the leaders and actually the most scalable solution in the whole API management space, which is one of the reasons why we picked them. So that's a very good thing to have in mind. Let's go over the architecture in general so that you get an idea of which parts we're talking about. So first of all, when connectivity is established, right, some kind of a client is going to make a request, right? In this environment, we're just going to call it a client. And it's going to be authenticated in the API management layer and tied to what is being called a consumer, right? In the IRIS world, we would call this a user, right? In this world, we're going to call it a consumer. The consumer then tries to basically send this message to the endpoint that this message is targeted at, right? Because keep in mind, an API management layer basically is just a proxy, right? It takes a message and tries to point it to the right endpoint and then take the response from that endpoint and brings it back and delivers it to the client who made the request, right? So in order to figure out to which endpoint we should send this message, a route is going to try to figure out how to treat this message. So a route is going to have a couple of configuration parameters, like from which URL is this request coming from? To which URL is it going to, right? From which domain is it coming from? From which IP address? Is this a whitelisted IP range? Is it a blacklisted IP range? All of these kinds of things. And based on all of these parameters, it's going to determine to which service endpoint it's going to forward the request. Okay. The service endpoints are called a service in this environment. So your IRIS instance is a service, basically, right? If you have multiple IRIS nodes, you would have multiple services defined in here. If all of these services share the same capabilities, and you basically have them there to share the load, to balance the load, IAM can do the load balancing for you. So you can group them together through what's called an upstream, and then configure the algorithm to balance the load, right? With a ring balancer or a round-robin balancer. So that's going to determine how we're going to share the load across the services. That's basically it, right? From a technology perspective, this is basically an engine server sitting there, which is being configured through the user interface or the APIs from IAM. So basically, technology-wise, this is really just an engine server sitting there. And that is one of the reasons why it's so performing. So you might wonder, okay, so how do I configure it and add behavior? And you do this by adding plugins and attaching plugins to all of these players that you've seen on that screen, right? So a couple of plugins that you see here is like a canary plugin for slowly rolling out new features. There's a throttling plugin so that you can manage how many messages are allowed for a certain time window. You have plugins for authentication, you have plugins for logging, and you can attach these plugins basically either globally, which means they apply to any request that goes through the system, or you can attach them to a service, to a route, to a consumer, or later on we will see that to a consumer group, right? And that gives you full flexibility depending on how you set up your system. You can say, hey, for this REST endpoint on my IRIS systems, I'm going to have a load balance, a throttling algorithm determined for it. For another one, I'm going to block it for today because it's in maintenance, it's not available. And for another one, it's just going to be free and open and no authentication at all. Okay, so you're very flexible, right? And this architecture in general fulfills a very high performance requirements in general because you're only attaching plugin behavior exactly where it's supposed to be and nowhere else. And that makes it very lightweight. What you get right away when you set up IAM is automated monitoring for all the requests that go through it, requests and responses. And that's one of the biggest impacts for somebody who has never worked with IPA management layers before, right? It's usually one of those aha moments where you see, hey, awesome, these are all the requests that are going through. And oh, I can see which endpoints are popular and I can see which endpoints are not popular. I can start to determine if my old versions of my API is something I can start to deprecate and fade out, or if they're still popular, and then I can start to dig deeper and figure out why is everybody still on my old version and not upgrading to the new one, right? These are data points you get right away without any additional overhead, and that's very useful. So that's about it for the quick introduction. And we're now going to switch over to Bob talking about what's new in 2.8.
All right, thanks, Stefan. So as Stefan said, we're excited today to announce the release of IAM 2.8.1. It is based on Kong Gateway Enterprise 2.8.1. Our partner has been hard at work since our last release, which was in 2021. And they have significant improvements, and we'll talk about them in three categories: the core enhancements, the plugins, some UI improvements to the portal. Kong does maintain a really nice change log if you want to go through each and every change that has been committed to the system. So let's look into the core API Manager. In my view, the most important and interesting feature that's come in is something called consumer groups. Consumer groups allow you to group together consumers so that you can use an advanced rate limiter to say, oh, the consumers in this group all get one rate limit, and the consumers in another group get a different rate limit. And anyone who's not in either of those get a default rate limit. So you could sell a silver plan and a gold plan for tiering of your API. I find this a lot easier to manage than what you'd have to do before, which is each consumer, you would have to set up the rate limit and manually maintain it yourself. And a lot of people found that cumbersome, certainly I do. 2.8 also includes support for event hooks. So event hooks allows you to basically send to a URL when some event happens on Kong. So for example, you could send a message to PagerDuty if one of your endpoints starts returning errors. Right? That's a pretty common thing to do, or whatever PagerDuty equivalent you're using. There are also improvements to hybrid mode. Hybrid mode will allow you to allow the control plane to function if the database is down, which is new. Additionally, the control plane can be upgraded separately from the data plane, so you can have a smoother upgrade process if you need to. In addition to what there's kind of headline items that you see, Kong is working on a number of things in the background. So they're working on replacing the cryptographic foundations of what they've been using. They've been swapping out the primary cryptographic layer, which is OpenSSL, with a FIPS 140-2 compliant boring SSL is what it's called, compliant library. Here is when I would say, hey, let's see the demo of consumer groups in action. But we were having technical difficulties. So I will have to find a way to maybe do a webinar so you could all see the demos of all of this in action. But let me show you how this works. If I can get to the next slide. Do you see that? Yeah. So you start with some service, like the coffee maker service. The coffee maker service, for those of you who might be new to IAM, if you go to the first look for the IAM, that will walk you through setting up a first service with Kong, and it's the coffee maker service. It lists a bunch of coffee makers. I can't recommend that enough. It's a great place to get started. So we'll start with that, and we will set up the rate limiting advanced plugin. So this is the new version of the rate limiting plugin that lets you set the default rate limit. You also tell it which consumer groups you want to apply to this particular rate limiter. You then create the consumer groups, and then you set the rate limit for each of those consumer groups. And then you associate users with that consumer group, or I'm sorry, consumers with that consumer group. Almost called them by the IRIS name, then it would have been trouble. And what's great about all of this is that as you create new consumers, you just associate them with whatever tier that they should be associated with. You don't have to set up a rate limit for that consumer independently. And that saves you a lot of time, a lot of opportunities to make mistakes in your configuration. Again, here's where I'd be showing you and actually doing all of it. We will pretend I did that. Moving on, as Stefan said, what makes the API Manager awesome is the wide variety of plugins that are available for it that do all kinds of different things. There are a number of new and greatly updated plugins. You can look at the changelog to see the whole list. But here are 3 that I pulled out that I thought were kind of critically interesting and important. The JQ plugin, how many of you know JQ? Have used JQ? A couple of you. So it's a programming language, like grep is a programming language, for working with JSON. So if you have a JSON API and you want to apply some transformation to that JSON API, the JQ plugin will allow you to do that. So either on the inbound side or the outbound side. This is especially helpful when you have recalcitrant services or recalcitrant clients. So you've got a service that you can't get the owner of that service to change, but that API needs to change. Or you've got some client who just won't upgrade from version 2 to version 3 of your API, but you've got everyone else up there, so you can on the fly do translation for that one customer, and you could apply that through these JQ transformations. What's the other one I have up here? Oh, OPA. OPA, so how many people know about Open Policy Agent? No CNCF fanboys in the house. All right. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation has been leading this effort to have policies about who can access what be something that is written down in a standard format in code that gets checked in independent of the APIs. So if you happen to describe your policies in OPA format, you can use the OPA adapt or OPA plugin to apply those policies. What's great about this and what your security people love about this is a well-known standard, and it gets applied across the board, and that security policy gets checked in as a security policy file, and it can go through the whole release process just like any other code. The third one I have up here is for those of you who do API first development practices. So you write your API, and then you can have your web development team and your backend team working in parallel on the service at the same time. So there's a mocking plugin. So you give it your Swagger or Open API for your API description, and it will make up responses to API calls. And that'll probably be good enough for your UI team to really move forward and progress the API while the real backend is being developed. So those are the three plugins. And again, we'll pretend that I just demoed the plugins. One more area that's new that's worth highlighting is updates to the Management Console UI. There's filtering and sorting now available on all the lists. Some of you have noticed once you get up to a certain scale, especially with the plugins, that it's been kind of hard to find the thing that you were looking for. Now it's much, much easier. The development portal, so again, talking about Open API, the development portal is now TLS 1.3 is supported in there. So again, a little bit more security and just keep moving the bar forward. So what's next? Coming up in kind of a future version, I know everyone wants to know, well, what's the future look like? Well, here's one of the important features that's up. It's actually in beta in 2.8.1. You do have to do some special juggling to enable it. But this is secrets management. So one of the questions that people often ask is around, hey, I've got this plugin that talks to my OLAP server and it needs credentials to talk to that OLAP server. How do I keep those credentials secure? Not just the OLAP server, there the whole list, you see them here on the left-hand side. Now you'll be able to store those credentials in HashiCorp Vault. You'll be able to store them in AWS's Secrets Manager or in environment variables, which really makes everything a lot safer and more secure. That was all I had for my update. Stefan, back to you, my friend.
Back to me. So let's talk a little bit about best practices. That's something I can't stress enough. They're, as with all of these tools, they're very flexible, right? In theory, you can build like one rule or one route to basically just say, hey, everything that goes to /iris/API, just forward it to my Iris instance. And then I'm done, right? All of my Iris endpoints are exposed and I'm happy, right? That's like a catch-all route. And that's a pretty bad thing to do. Why is that? because basically all the data, all the monitoring, but also all the governance that you can do and apply to it, like adding a plugin, is something that you apply on the level of a route or a service, right? So if there's one specific endpoint that you would like to secure in a different way, or you would like to establish a certain amount of throttling to it, or you want to take it down for maintenance, that's something you can do if you have one catch-all route for all of your endpoints, right? What you really want is you want to have one route for every individual REST endpoint and for any combination of the HTTP verbs that it can cover, right? So if you have the same endpoint with a get verb, but also with a put verb, that's two routes, right? One for get, one for put. And that means you can monitor them differently. You will see how many call it with get, and you will see how many call it with a put. You can also secure them differently and govern them differently, which gives you, in the end, more power to manage your system, right? So that should be the default. So the interesting thing here about this is very often like, hey, how am I supposed to do that, right? Isn't this like nitty-gritty, and do I have to make changes to my API manager all the time when I add a new REST endpoint, right? The good thing about the API manager is that everything that you see in the UI, everything that you've seen in the screenshots so far, is all exposed through REST APIs as well, right? So you can add routes through a REST call. You can change them through REST calls. You can add consumers through REST calls. Everything can be made through REST calls, right? So one of the things I've done in a little exercise that took me like 20 minutes on my system is basically I just go through a Swagger specification that I have on my server. I just walk it, and for every definition in there, I create a route and a service endpoint definition for that particular endpoint. So I never have to actually go manually into my IAM instance and define my routes. I just push a button, and everything is automatically updated, right? So that's one of the things that you can build very easily with IAM, which I think makes it very powerful. The next thing is a little bit about infrastructure. We're going to talk about hybrid mode in a second. Bob already mentioned it. For those who don't know what the hybrid mode is at this point, I'm going to cover it in a nutshell. And the most important thing here right now is if you're running a dev portal, the developer portal, which is like the user interface for developers that want to explore your REST endpoints, right? That want to understand which endpoints do you offer and what's the documentation for those. That's what the developer portal offers. That should be running on a dedicated node, right? From a technical perspective, it can be hosted on the same node that runs and deals with the traffic. But from an operational perspective, it's much simpler if you dedicate one specific node for the developer portal, right? Because that's potentially a different security group, that's potentially a different group of users that have access to it, and it potentially has different maintenance windows when you want to maintain it and take it offline. So if you separate those out into different nodes, you're just making your life much easier. Okay, that's in general a guidance. We're going to talk about configuration management as well. And the advice I have here is to use the tool called DEC, which is the configuration management tool from Kong, which makes your life also much easier. We actually do have a demo of that as well and on slides. So I actually can run through that, which is awesome. So the basic architecture, when you probably start off playing with IAM, is that you have like one simple node of IAM, and that needs to connect to a database node, right? By default, this is going to be Postgres. It could also be Cassandra. That's something that just runs and is being spun up underneath the covers. You don't have to do anything specific for that. When you start it up, what this node has to do, it's going to connect to your IRIS instance. You have to configure that the IP address of your IRIS instance, to check the license and understand and evaluate if that license is IAM enabled, right? So it doesn't run on any license. You have to go to your account team and say, hey, you know what? I want to use API management. And then we're going to issue a license for you that includes API management, right? And that's because we're doing this together with our partner Kong. So we need to issue a license that includes a Kong license underneath, right? So that's the background here. There are a couple of ways how you can configure that. Most importantly, in case you haven't seen that, that license check can also now be done over HTTPS, and you just have to configure a certificate for that if that's what you want to do. So that's one of the updates we've done in the last version. So one of the next things you usually do is when you want to scale out, is you're going to add more nodes of IAM if one node can't handle all the load, or if you want to add high availability to an environment. And the way how you do this is you add one more node to IAM and point it to the same database. And by pointing it to the same database, they automatically form a cluster. So every IAM node that's connected to the same DB is part of the cluster. Okay, automatically. That means they share the same configuration, they share the same consumers, same routes, same service definition, everything. They also have aggregated metrics. So if one message goes through instance 1 and another message goes through instance B, you will have a total count of 2 messages, right? No matter through which instance you go for reporting. Obviously, if you do that, then in the front, you're going to set up a load balancer like F5 or HA proxy, whatever you use in your environment. And if you then want to add even more high availability to the system, what you want to do is add a secondary DB node, right? Because if your database node goes down, then you can't spin up new instances of IAM because they have no DB to connect to and no way to load the configuration, right? So you want a secondary node of your database. That's the piece that can be tricky because, as you probably know, everything here is being delivered as containers, OCI compliant containers, and managing these failovers in containers with databases is not trivial. So since this is not an IRIS instance, but it's Postgres or Cassandra, that's something that can be a little bit difficult depending on the version of the database that you're using. So in general, our recommendation is if you want to use high availability, don't use the picture that I've just showed you. Instead, use the hybrid mode. Okay, the hybrid mode makes your life much, much easier. So why is that? The hybrid mode basically separates out nodes into 2 different planes. One is the data plane, and all the nodes that are in the data plane only take care of dealing with API traffic. They can't be configured. They don't have a user interface. They won't show you any metrics. The only thing they do is proxy traffic. Okay? That's the purpose of the data plane. And then you have the control plane on the other side. That looks much more like a Recruiter setup that I've just shown you. It's one node of IAM connected to your database, which holds the configuration. Okay? So what happens? In the control plane, you're going to configure your system. So you're going to add routes, you're going to add service definitions, you're going to add consumers and add plugins and all of these things. And every time you do that, in the same instant, that configuration is being pushed automatically on a secure channel over HTTPS to the data plane. Okay? So the data plane is automatically updated with the new configuration. And when traffic goes through the data plane, all those metrics are pushed back to the control plane because the control plane actually gives you the user interface and all the tools to look at the metrics. Okay? So that's in general the separation that we have here. So you will notice that the data plane now works without any connectivity to a database. So even if your control plane goes down in theory, your data plane is just going to work, right? The only thing you can't do is add more nodes at this point. You will need a functioning control plane in order to add more nodes to your data plane. So let's take a look at what happens if your control plane goes down. Okay, my control plane just died. What does this mean? There are two things that we're going to lose. The first thing is we can't push more updates, right? We can't add a new route. We can't change the configuration because we're going to do that through the control plane. Okay, so we're losing that functionality. What we're also losing is the metrics. The data plane is trying to push those metrics to the control plane, but the control plane is down. So we're losing the metrics for the time window where the control plane is down. As soon as the control plane comes back up, we're going to have the metrics again, right? But there's no buffering of the metrics and we're going to resend them. That's not going to happen. When the control plane is down for those 5 minutes, we're going to lose the metrics for those 5 minutes, okay? So how do we make this system more stable? How can we prevent the control plane from going down? So one option is, well, add more IAM nodes to the control plane. If one IAM node in my control plane goes down, I still have the other nodes. You can still form a cluster there, right? That's awesome. But what happens if the database goes down? Well, we could add a secondary database node. But that's what I just told you is difficult, right? So we don't want to do that, okay? So blank sheet of paper, my control plane is down. What do? We're doing it the right way from a container philosophy perspective. Just kill it, right? Kill all the processes, kill the containers. We don't care. They're dead. Spin up a new environment and load the configuration. Boom, done. Okay? And the way how we're going to do this is with DAC. You need configuration management in order to do that. DAC allows you to extract the configuration of one control plane, or in general of one cluster, and store it in a YAML file, which also makes it easy for you to take that file, put it into source control, diff it, and understand how your configuration changed over time, right? That makes your process in general more stable and more robust, right? So to give you an idea on how this works, I have a very simple instance of IAM on this PowerPoint slide with just one service endpoint, which I called IRIS, okay? So I'm running DAC on my local environment, and because my IAM instance is local, it automatically is going to connect to my local IAM instance. I can always configure it to also point to remote IAM cluster, right? In that case, you just provide the IP address too and the ports. In this case, it's defaulting to local. So I'm going to say DAC dump to the file iam.yaml, okay? So because my IAM instance is really simple, it's going to be a very simple YAML file with just one definition of one service endpoint, which is named IRIS, as you can see in line 5, right? So I can take this file, check it in my source control, and be happy. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reset my IAM instance. So I'm calling DAC reset. And what this is going to do, it's going to delete all the entities that are in that instance. It's resetting it to scratch, which is awesome for dev and test environments, by the way. Just so, hey, take this IAM instance and burn it down. I want a clean slate, right? And that's a really good capability to have. So now I want to load that configuration. So I'm going to say DAC sync, and I hand it over the file that I've just created. So you're seeing here, whatever, here, it's just saying creating a new service called IRIS, right? So now I realize, okay, I don't want this service endpoint to be called IRIS. I want it to be called my IRIS. It's the wrong name, right? I want to change the name. So I go back into my file and edit it in my file configuration and say, okay, the new name is my IRIS. So what I'm going to do now, in this case, a little bit different syntax. I could just call deck sync, and it would push the update. What I'm doing here is I'm doing a deck diff, which is basically, it's doing a sync without actually doing a sync. So it's just telling me what it would do, but it's not going to do it. Okay, and what it would do is basically it would delete the service IRIS and create a service my IRIS. Okay, that's how a renaming actually takes place. Okay, it's not going to change the name of that service endpoint, it's going to actually create a new entity. Okay, so if I actually run a deck sync right now and go back into my portal, you will see there's now a service endpoint definition which is called my IRIS. Okay, so that's one very simple use case of deck, right? It's a very simple to use tool, as you can see here. Very simple commands, but very, very powerful, and something you should use even if you're not using the hybrid mode. But with hybrid mode, this is just making your HA and DR so much simpler. So key takeaways is always have a backup plan, right? I think for the demos, what we're trying to do is we're going to schedule something in the tech exchange. We can schedule demos there on the fly, basically. And we will try to send a push update through the cVent app that you hopefully all have on your phones with the date and times for that, probably tomorrow or Thursday. That's one of the things we're trying to do. If that doesn't work, we're going to do a webinar afterwards, okay, so we can see it. So the cool new things we have in 2.8 are basically the consumer groups. They're pretty awesome if you want to build something like silver tiers, gold tiers, and treat groups of users in the same way. That makes your life much, much simpler. We have UX improvements, security improvements, as you've seen, and a couple of new plugins that are very powerful. I think the QD, what's the name? Say again. I'm lacking the JQ, thank you. The JQ plugin is probably the ones that's most interesting to the majority of you. Best practices, we talked a little bit of hybrid mode. I would always recommend to set up an environment in hybrid mode. If you just want to get started and have a quick experience, okay, get started with the normal mode, that's fine. But if you want to go to production, I would always recommend to go hybrid mode. It's not much difficult, it's not more difficult. It takes probably 5 minutes more, so we're doubling from 5 to 10 minutes. And the most critical piece is you need a certificate, because the communication between the data plane and the control plane is always encrypted, so that nobody can hack in with another control plane that they set up and just hijack your configuration, right? That's the whole thing that makes the setup a little bit more complex, okay? We talked a little bit about route management. Make sure that you don't have catch-all routes, but specific routes. That's what you really want. And use deck in general for your configuration management. Couple more things, like there are tools that you can use out there that are very useful, like Insomnia, which is like the development studio from Kong, which I can recommend for mocking up and building new services. But if you don't use a tool like that, at least use something like Postman as a client when you create the requests. Don't use something like curl. That's just much more complicated to use as soon as you're building more complicated test cases like using OAuth2 or adding payloads. That's more complicated. There are a couple of sessions we can recommend. One is a session that's happening like right now, so you gotta run. But you can always look at the slides of that session in the app. You've probably heard that before. For every session that you're going to, you will find the slides directly in the app for that session. And that can be very helpful if two sessions that are of interest for you are happening at the same time. Then at least you can take a look at the slides and get a sense of what was covered. And then also find the speaker and hunt them down in the tech exchange, obviously. Later today at, I believe, 4:30, there's also an open Q&A with all the product management teams from our department. So come to that with your questions. You can always also ask these questions through the app and through the email list up front if you want to. That's fine too. And we've provided a couple of links that you can find in the slides. They're actually links, so you can click them when you download the slides for all of the tools that we covered right now, like the hybrid mode and deck, which is very useful. So to that regard, I would like to say thank you. Reach out to us if you have any questions. We're going to stay here a couple more minutes. We're also going to be in the tech exchange. I hope you have a fun rest of the day and also of the rest of the conference. So enjoy your day. Take care.